So here's what we're working on. We've got the timber frame all out, studded out, and these are the boards we're going to be using. These are STS boards. I got them from Wix, fairly cheap. They were like £20 a board, and these are the screws that you should be using for them. So these are great because even though they are quite thin, they countersink into the boards. Now if I was using any other boards, they never work as good as these. Now don't get me wrong, they're not cheap. They're about £5 a box, and they don't take you that far, but they are a lot better to use these screws for these boards. And the reason I use these boards is because Baumit, the company I'm using, guaranteed it. So another tip, when you're cutting these boards, use a little skill saw. It'll ruin your blade, but it's so much faster. And due to the nature of this job, with it being cement board, it will take longer than what it was just standard plaster board. But yeah, using the correct tools and correct saws, as in skill saw, will make the job a lot easier. And I always leave a little gap in the middle. That was a tip handed to me by a YouTube subscriber, by the way, so thanks a lot for that. As you can see, a little drain pipe here is a bit forward, so I've had to build a platform around it and kind of bed that into itself, which we'll go into later on. Again, using the same screws, and that is the job done. I'm not going to harper on too much about this because all you're doing is fixing boards to a wall. So that's that. These are the mesh beads you should be using. You don't use corner beads. This is a very thin line system, so it's only about 3mm beads all in all. I'm using this Bondit Pro here, that's the company, and I'm just gluing them on. Because the board should be plumb, and that's if the stud work was plumb. This wasn't too amazing, to be honest, but this glue gives you a bit of play. But always level it up, don't fully rely on a board. So I've got my spirit level there, making sure everything's all good. Now before you start, what you should do is mesh the joints as well with fiberglass tape. But a big tip, cut your lengths of mesh. We're going to be using this render mesh. This is the render mesh that you can buy from any store. You can buy it from Amazon. I'll leave a link below this video. That's the exact stuff I'm using, so I will leave a link in the video below, description below, sorry. And what we're going to do is apply base coat. This is Star Contact. This is the adhesive, but it's also the base coat designed to be used directly onto boards. So you don't need any primer. Again, STS boards are backed by Baumit, so you just render directly onto them. If you're a plasterer, I just mix this up to the same consistency what you've had British Gypsum hardwall. You don't want it too thick, and all you're doing is applying a thin layer. This is the first layer, just put a nice thin layer on the go here. And now this is why it was so important to get the sheets cut out before we started. So you apply one, you put about 1 meter ahead of yourself. All we're going to do is apply the render on as it is, so just working all the way down to the bottom. And what you do is you embed the mesh as well. So you apply the render and you cover the mesh on the mesh beads. Don't worry about the beads being covered up. The thin coat system isn't designed to have a lip. What we're going to do is completely lose the beads with the backing coat. So render all the way to the bottom. This is a drip bead. Render it all the way down and cover the bead completely. Don't worry about anything showing. We are completely covering the bead. And this is why it was so important to get the mesh cut beforehand, because again, I was working on my own on this job. It's a lot better with 2 people, but if you have the mesh cut into place, it's going to make it a lot easier. So you start from the top and you just roll the mesh down. Again, because we've rolled it up, it's all cut into position. It just rolls itself down and you just flatten it into the render as you go. All you're doing is just pulling the render and the fat all the way to the surface, making sure it's completely emerges the mesh, and make sure there's nothing behind as well. That was a bit of grit. And you just completely cover it up. So again, roll it as you go. Don't roll it all the way to the floor. It'll just make it hard for yourself. As you're working down, cut it across. Now this is a little tip. Leave 100mm from where the mesh finished. Come back on yourself and score a little line. What we need to do is when we're applying the render, we need to make sure that when we apply the next bit of mesh, there's a 100mm overlap. So that line there is going to be a gauge of where the overlap will end. So you apply your Star Contact render. Again, we're only putting about 2-3mm on. Nice tight coat. Apply it, make sure it's all flattened, get the mesh, and then bed it to that line. That line there is just a rough gauge of the 100mm, and it's just an easy way to make sure that you're going to have enough coverage and overlap to make sure you're covered. And that's just to make sure that if there is any movement, then everything is sorted. Now what I like to do is once I've applied that, I put another tight coat of render on, and that's to make sure that it's plumb. So even though it's timber frame, it wasn't actually bang on, it wasn't perfect. So I then go back on myself, I know the mesh is bedded into the render, bedded into the boards. I just put another tight coat on, and that's the coat that I rule. So let's do that. This is it. This is a render that's been applied on top of the mesh coat, and all I'm doing is ruling it flat. So even though we're working on boards, I still like to rule it, and I still like to make sure that it is dead flat, because again, it's still render, you're out in the elements, and when that sun shines through, you'll see everything. And then I come back on myself and I float it. Just like any other render, we've always been taught, and I've always been taught, to float up the star contact, and actually if you catch it at the right time, it floats up quite nicely. So once you've come back, that time you've gone over that wall, flattened it, come back to the beginning, because it's such a thin coat, it floats in nicely and it won't take you long at all. It's not like waiting for standard sand cement, it floats up nicely. So then what you do is wait 1 day between coats, and then this is where the wall you're left with, and you should prime it. Now I've got a confession to make. I didn't actually use the right primer. We should have used Baumit Uni Primer, but I could not get it. There's like a 3-weight lead. I got the star contact, I got the mesh, I got the beads, but I could not get the Uni Primer. I also had the top coat from a previous job. So it should be Baumit Uni Primer that they used. We used them a render grit from one of my local building merchants, and I did a test run first. I did a little slab where I put some star contact on, tested the primer, and then put the top coat on, and it was absolutely fine. So I just had to tell you that, yeah, I use another product. I did aim to get the right one, but with a 3-week wait, it was just too long. It was either that or don't do the job within 3 weeks. I had a tight deadline, so I improvised, and it worked well. So there was that render primer that I used, it was all good. But let's carry on with the video. So I had just applied this using a roller, fairly simple. It was actually really good stuff, really smooth. It's quite a thin base product, and it covered well as well. But yeah, again, uni primers are stuff you're supposed to use. Don't scrimp about on that. It was 3 times cheaper though. So what I do with the top coat, this top coat, I always add a little bit of water to it. And the reason is, if you don't, it is very thick as it comes. It doesn't look like a thick product, but if you use it as is without any water, when you're applying it, you will lose a lot. Now, I must admit, I put a bit too much water in. It was a bit like paint, but I find it's so little waste when it's this thin, because it just really grips that primer and it doesn't slip back. I've got a little clip in a bit of where I use it as if it was in the tub, and that's a bit of an earlier video. But yeah, I always water it down. Just do it in slow portions first. You don't want to put a lot in. So just add little bits. And what you'll realise when you're applying it, you'll see when you've got the right amount of water, because it just grips to the render as it is. So if you don't, it will fall off and you just will lose a lot of the stuff. So what you do is you apply it in sections. And it is very runny. Make sure you cover everything up, because as a product in general, if it's too thick, it'll fall over the floor. And if it's very wet, then it's very viscous and you will lose a bit. Anyway, so to be honest, you can't really win with this. Now, I'm going to go into the float and what we use properly in a bit, but this is just a renderer's float. It's a Rafina flatline one. It's one you designed specifically for silicone rendering. I'll go into that in a second. I'll show you. So what I like to do is use this float to scrape back. What you always do when you apply the top coat, you always have to scrape it back again, and that's because it needs to be paper thin. This is the 1.5mm texture, and basically that is how thin it is on the wall. It's very thin product indeed, and it's just basically paint with aggregate in it. And all you do once you've applied it, once you've stripped it back, is you just float it in circular motions, and what that does is it closes all the pores up. Real nice texture. It gives it a finish, a closer finish to sand cement. Now ideally this product is better with 2 people, I must admit. Here's a clip where I did a previous video with my friend Charlie. Put your head in the camera. How's it going? Yeah, that was us. Now as you can see, the product is quite thick here, but the idea is you've got one person applying the render, and then I'm coming up behind, taking back the excess, and then I'm floating it up directly behind him. You save so much time doing it this way, and this is a float that you use. It's very thin, there's nothing to it basically, and as you can see, this is the texture, and this is why you need to strip it back, because if it gets clumpy otherwise, it kind of congeals and creates like a weird cluster. This is why you need to strip it back once he's applied it. take it back to the aggregate, and then once you close it in with the floating process, it really closes in the pores and it gives you that lovely tight texture. If you don't pull it back, that's when you get problems. So this is us applying it. Now what I do is apply it in like meter sections. Again, I'm on my own. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because even though it's an easy product, it can dry and it can be a bit hard to float into itself if you leave it so too long. So like the mesh, I just work in meter sections, apply the render and then float it back. Do you like my hands-free mechanism, by the way? I always do this. Set of air defenders, strap the phone to my head. There's a tip that's totally irrelevant to rendering, but that's how I go about hands-free. There's no point getting nice headphones, I ruin them. Back to the video. So applying a tight coat of render. And again, the good thing about when you wet it down, it allows you to get it nice and tight in the first place. Again, the thicker the product is, the more you've got to take off as you go. I just find it's a lot easier to rule back with the Raffina float, or any float for this silicone float, but people have said that it's good to use a flexi trowel for the stripping back stage, so maybe give that a go. I haven't personally. So yeah, you strip it back, and then what that allows you is then to float it up. And this is it. This is basically how easy it is. It's really nice as well to blend into yourself. So all you do is kind of move the product into an old area you worked on, and then it just really blends into itself nicely. You don't have to worry like sand cement where you're going to see the join marks. Once you're floating it in, it's giving you enough time working in them 1 meter sections. Gives you enough time to work it into the product whilst it's still wet. You can see there's no joins, there's no marks. So it's very fast circular motions, and what you're doing is just closing the product up. Again, you'll see in a minute where it kind of congeals again. This is why it's so important to strip it back, because it can clump up. There's a section down the right that's clumpy. Just use the same flow, put the product back in the bucket, and then off you go. On the beads, I like to work up horizontally and vertically, but I go up vertically, go up and down, and then work the product away from the bead. That way the aggregate in the silicone render won't cluster around the beads. You want it nice and tight. And again, the floating stage, we've just worked tightly to the beads, we've covered it up, but it leaves it nice and square, and the silicone render just kind of follows it. What I'm doing there at the drip bead is just getting rid of an excess. Again, working out across it, across the length of the bead, and that means you're getting rid of any aggregate that might have clustered up on that area. But as you can see, all it does is closes the pores, and it's a very easy system. See, again, vertically, it takes off the excess aggregate, and it just leaves you with a nice clean bead. Easy, lovely finish, and you don't have to worry, like unlike with sand cement where you're going to catch yourself, you've got to kind of follow it in. It is very nicely blended into itself, and that's because basically it is paint with aggregate in. So here's the finishing products. I've cut the bead, the tape back, sorry. Always tape it up because it will stain everything. So on brickwork, always use masking tape. Cut it back at the end, and always cover up around your windows. That's the end of the video. If you like this video, please hit the like button, please subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment. Have you used it before? Is there another product that you use other than Baumit, and how do you find it as a renderer using this stuff? Now if you'd like to see how I tackle a sand cement rendering job where I fully show you the full process from start to finish, from bead to mixing to application to finish, then click this video here and I'll show you everything I know about sand cement. And click here to subscribe. See you in the next one. Cheers.